Thank you so much for joining us, talking to Voice of America here on the studio. I really appreciate that you're here. You're an Iranian American, so you also, have expertise on foreign policy, national security, or so. Let us know more about you first, and then I'm sure we have a wonderful conversation with each other. But let's know you about more first.
First of all, let me thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be here, excited to have a conversation with you and obviously your viewers as well. Look, as you mentioned, I've been in this foreign policy, national security space for almost 2 decades. It's been, I started out my career working on domestic politics, working for a California State Assembly member, then going into a U.S. Senator's office. But there was always a sort of internationalist component inside of me. I didn't know if it was my Iranian roots or if it was, I was raised multilingual, so I had the Farsi and the French. I did an internship for the State Department at the U.S.'s mission to NATO in Brussels, where I was able to use my English, my French, engage with so many different countries all at once. I realized that there is something inside of me that I do enjoy the negotiations, the international relations, seeing sort of what we're working on in these major newspapers, and being able to help the world. I think that was something that was flourishing inside of me. I came to Washington and began working for the State Department for about 17 years. And that took me then to the White House, working for the National Security Council. While I was there, I had the opportunity to sort of support President Biden's first sort of summit for democracy in 2021, and then in 2022 working sort of on our partnerships and global engagement team, which essentially allowed me to work with the diaspora groups inside the United States, talking about our foreign policy objectives. I then left government, worked for the private sector, kind of the juncture between private sector and foreign policy. So it was a interesting angle and perspective as sort of the war in Ukraine was playing out. And I've since started working in sort of this think tank space, providing sort of the policy analysis and perspectives of what's happening in the world, and simultaneously teaching undergraduates about State Department, statecraft, diplomacy. So again, thanks for having me.
Oh, fantastic. So you've been in government this long, so you work with both Republican and Democrat governments all around. So
absolutely.
You've seen a lot, probably.
Absolutely. Again, you work at the pleasure of the president. That is sort of the objective.
Okay. You touched upon the Democracy Summit 2021. Could you bring it, just open it more for us? How was it? What was the objective? What happened? Just give us an overview.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that question. Just to set the stage a little bit, when we think back to January of 2021, COVID was still in full swing, and it was on the heels of January 6th in the United States. And the president and President Biden had just joined, and he had made a campaign promise to create a summit for democracy, to galvanize everyone around a table. So the main objective, there were 3 components. It was talking about democracy versus authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, what had transpired, combating corruption, and advancing human rights. And so what the summit did was it brought together 100+ leaders, countless civil society leaders, students, local elected officials, to be able to have that conversation together around the table. And I think when we think about it, that was the first Summit for Democracy. We've had 2 others since. And when we think about where we are now in 2024, this is the year of elections. There's over 60 elections taking place this year around the world, whether at the presidential level or the local parliamentarian level. And it's quite an important year even in the United States, and now most recently in Iran with the snap elections that are taking place. And so it's more critical than ever before for folks to go out and vote. And I think it's important, as we sit here as Iranian Americans, going out and voting in the United States or Iranians, and I think you have quite a bit of viewers inside Iran, to be able to go vote. I think, it's unfortunate when we look at a lot of the polling that comes out and the low voter turnout, whether inside Iran or even in the United States by the Iranian diaspora. I think it's important that, we're able to voice our thoughts. And so I think one of the things that the Summit for Democracy was able to sort of highlight is the importance of democracy, right? These are your freedoms, these are your rights, and to be able to voice those is quite key.
Even talking about the Democracy Summit is bizarre, because we are talking about Democracy Summit 2021, and there were two, as you said, after. But in 2024, when we have two major wars in the world stage, one is in Russia, Ukraine, one is in Israel, Hamas. What is happening in this war that, from that we just very quickly come to this very volatile, very, very unpredictable, or somehow uncharted territories?
Right, like you said, I think this is quite complex. I mean, it's like 3D chess in terms of where we are in geopolitics. And so when we think about it, we can't think about these as sort of singular actions, right? Like Russia essentially violated international law by invading Ukraine. And again, what we saw with October 7 and sort of where the deep-rooted contention lies, are important factors. And so when you look at sort of, and again, speaking to sort of your program in terms of Iran, looking at sort of the actions that they are doing, the proxies, and sort of how they're playing the game in geopolitics is something that's important. And again, I think I get very nervous when we think about things in such singular fashion. But I think when we go back to your original question in terms of the Summit for Democracy and sort of the importance of democracy, I think that's where it's important, right? Yeah. Being able to go out and vote, being able to voice those opinions, being able to come together as civil society, where civil society can articulate sort of the importance, whether it's the importance of peace, importance of working together. And that gets lost when we start focusing on sort of these singular actions that are happening in the world.
Yeah, it's bizarre in some ways, because I think since World War II, at least, I mean, there were some aggressions from here and there. There were some, but most of it were internal. Former Yugoslavia, right. What's happening, Afghanistan, Taliban. But full-scale war of one country to another, like Russia did to Ukraine, is unprecedented. Could you make sense what that direction is going? No one knows. We know what the people stand, or countries or policies. We stand big array in Russia or so, but what's going to happen at the end?
I mean, that's $1 million question, but you're absolutely right. I think one of the things that the United States is doing so well is making sure, and the West, sort of this sort of containment, and making sure, to your exact point, that given the unprecedented actions, it does not become repetitive in other places and in other regions of the world. And I think that is one of the most fundamental components. And again, sort of not to hark back to the Summit for Democracy, but again, there's this importance of multilateralism. There's this importance of coming together as groups of countries, ensuring that there is sort of rule of law and order, which has been lost. This global order that you're mentioning essentially has been lost. And so I think that's the most important factor, is making sure that there aren't fissures in those relationships. There aren't fissures in sort of like the ability to come together to address these global problems. And so it's important for us to keep track on that. Again, $1 million question, sort of how it all evolves, but I do think there's an important factor of coming together as a global community to make key decisions.
You use the phrase three-dimensional chess, which I love it. I'm just going to add another front into it. We're talking about Russia and Ukraine. Now Iran comes into play. I'm sure you know, last administration in the United States had like 4 years of maximum pressure campaign, sanctions or so. President Biden came in with very fresh outlook. And even he, from the campaign, he said, I'm going to take U.S. back to JCPOA. We want to do something. We want to have a relentless diplomacy. We do something about it or so. With this attitude from the U.S. government, Islamic Republic of Iran ends up being ally of Russia in a war in European soil with Ukraine. What was in it for them to do that? Why? It's a 3D chess. I don't get it, but could you please open it up for us?
Well, so I think there's multiple sort of components to your question. I think let me start with the final point in terms of sort of the opportunist nature of Iran's sort of foreign policy and the decisions that it makes. I mean, the sort of economic relief that they were seeking and the payments that they were seeking out through engagement with Russia is something that we need to take into account. I think the irony, maybe to talk about, is when Khomeini started, he essentially said na gharb na sharq, and now he's Iran is now creating these relationships, whether it's with Iran. Let's not forget China, right? I mean, Iran sent a very large delegation to China over a year or so ago to create a lot of these sort of economic bilateral engagements, and then China created sort of that rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So when we think about this, there's a little bit more at play beyond just that one, the series of engagements Iran is having with Russia. There is more of that geopolitical stance and kind of the opportunistic nature of the regime and how it operates for its own benefit. But to your exact point, I mean, Iran is operating through so many proxies and sort of instigating so many different mini conflicts throughout the region. And I think when the Biden administration came in, the key point was to be able to bring about a bit of, for lack of a better term, sort of normalcy, right? Making sure you could bring Iran to the negotiating table to stop them from creating their nuclear ambitions, to sort of scale back that sort of opportunity. Unfortunately, where we are now, Iran continues to increase its capabilities. And it's this sort of small step-by-step approach in terms of being able to engage with Iran. And unfortunately, we have to think about, again, back to the dynamics. Where are we in the world? What is happening between Russia, Ukraine? What's happening in the Middle East? And all the various factors that are at play. And so I think, partially sort of as Iran sits and thinks about it, they too are going to sit back and wait to see what happens with the U.S. presidential elections. Who are they going to be negotiating with at the end of 2024, essentially? And so I think it'll be interesting to see kind of the decisions that are made, even in Iran, who's elected or selected rather.
Or appointed.
For the role, and I think that'll also help with the determining factor of how those negotiations could essentially play out.
I just want to have a quick follow-up with you. You said na sharqi na gharbi, which is, that still is the slogan on the Islamic Republic foreign ministries wherever. The other thing odd thing about the Ukraine thing is that Islamic Republic of Iran, since the beginning, they had hostilities toward the United States, and that was obvious. But with Europe, they always wanted to have some kind of relationship in some ways or forms. When Europeans were so unhappy when last administration, U.S. administration, took up, left the JCPOA, they were so happy when President Biden says, we're going to go back. But in the out of it, I mean, I think the most allies in this area that was disappointed with the decision Iran made to support Russia were Europeans. And if you think about it, you want to have, if you're Iran, you want to have some kind of relationship with the European, but you just isolated all of them because of participating. What's in it for them?
I think, again, it's the economic relief, the immediate economic relief at that moment in time. And I think for them, they realize that the Europeans are still going to come to the negotiating table, as will the West, in terms of asking Iran to decrease its nuclear capabilities. So they know they haven't necessarily lost a negotiating counterpart, and the discussion is still on the table. And they, again, I think, as I said, it's the opportunistic nature of making those decisions, and what kind of economic relief are they getting from Russia that they weren't necessarily getting from the Europeans or the United States.
While we're on topic on Iran, and it's a presidential election year inside the United States, so it means that whatever the government is done is open for criticism or evaluation. How do you evaluate President Biden foreign policy towards Islamic Republic of Iran? It was a drastic change from the last administration. How do you see what are the achievements? Where were the failures?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, under the previous administration, under the Trump administration, there was the pulling out of the JCPOA negotiations, the nuclear negotiations, and then enforcing really tough sanctions against Iran with the intent that they will come to the negotiating table. Again, I think the end goal is the same across the board, but it's the negotiation tactics. For the United States under the Biden administration, again, there was an attempt to come back to the table, to come back to the negotiations, to have the conversation. And again, I think it depended on sort of the way the discussions were being held between the West and Iran, sort of the step-by-step. It was very much a drip-by-drip kind of conversation. And again, a lot of the geopolitics that were happening in the region started to change the nature of those conversations. I think one of the things that we should highlight, though, under the Biden administration is the hostage releases that occurred under his watch. I think that's an incredibly important factor. Those are very tough negotiations that are being held. And the fact that we were successfully able to bring so many back home was an important sort of point and major achievement under the Biden administration, considering sort of the delicate negotiations and conversations that are being had, not only on that, but then also on the nuclear ambitions by Iran.
Yeah, you touched upon hostages. I think that's the first act of foreign policy by the Islamic Republic of Iran after starting taking hostages. And they're still doing it successfully today with lots of benefits coming their way. I just wanted to ask you about, we talked about the last administration, the approach that they have, the different approach that this current administration has. We've somehow guessed or presumed that if there's a Republican administration in 2025, January 2025 in the White House, might be more like a maximum pressure or even more pressure or some kind of that nature. But you have no idea if President Biden wins the second term, what happens there. What do you think it happens? Do you think whatever they've done so far in these 4 years, can continue or should continue, or there are areas that this should be revamped or revised or recalibrated?
No, I think that's an excellent question. And again, I think a lot of these sort of situations, these are not static situations. There's constant evolution of what's happening in the world, the actions that Iran itself is taking, and sort of even Iran's calculus. So when we think back to sort of what the United States will do, be it Trump, be it Biden, I think, again, we're going to be taking a lot of these components into our factor and into our decision-making processes. This is not a unilateral decision. We're going to be working with the Europeans as well. Where is Europe? Europe is going through elections right now as well. There are certain elements at play that we need to take into consideration. I think under a Biden, as you rightly pointed, under a Trump administration, I do think you're going to see that sort of essence of maximum pressure. What does that mean? What does that entail? I think the devil is in the details, and we'll find those out as it gets could essentially get closer. In terms of the Biden administration, they have taken quite a bit of strong stance against sort of sanctioning very key nodes that will be more impactful against the regime and less so on your average Iranian citizen. But I think there will be a little bit more recalibration under a second term, sort of what is feasible, what's not feasible, what are the conversations like. But I do think there's an attempt to sort of be able to have those serious conversations after, in January of 2025, like you said, in terms of once it's very clear. I think Iran is not even willing to have a certain series of serious conversations because they too don't know who's going to win the elections in the United States. So the dynamic will change, and I do think there will be a recalibration in terms of the Biden administration's even ability to have a conversation where the other party is able to sort of engage a bit more.
Speaking of revamped, I just wanted to talk this about with you. When President Biden started the administration, the focus was, China, South China Sea, and just, going through that direction. The Russia attack to Ukraine just changed everything, and it's not just everything for the United States. It's almost for all the European countries. Now that's a key decision maker for all of those. Do you think the more this war with Ukraine lingers on, the more volatile even the whole Europe gets politically, especially as you said they are going to this election as well?
In terms of the U.S. administration and sort of the focus on the Indo-Pacific, I think they continue to maintain that. And I think they are, as the expression goes in American English, you can, chew gum and walk at the same time. So I do think there's been this ability to, again, have very sort of simultaneous streams of effort of maintaining the engagement with the Indo-Pacific while simultaneously making sure that Europe's security remains intact and the protection of Ukraine. But you rightfully point out, this sort of destruction that's happening in Ukraine and sort of Russia's brazen sort of attack on Ukraine did create sort of that moment of inflection in history and sort of how Europe thinks. I think this makes sort of the importance of NATO even more important, sort of, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier too, sort of the multilateral, the regionalism and the engagement together while countries sort of ensure that they're protected and supported against, potential brazen attacks or cyber attacks from the likes of Russia and others. So I don't think necessarily the attention has pivoted. I think it depends on sort of what you see in the news cycles and kind of the importance for whether the journalists or certain citizens. But I do think that there's still this simultaneous attention on both. And so I don't think anyone's reflection points have changed.
Okay. We talked about Iran policies and the United States. When you look at between the two, U.S. and Islamic Republic of Iran, some of challenges or issues we know about, like the nuclear issue, human rights. How deep these issues are? I'm sure with going back to the 3D chess, I think it's multifaceted. It has its different aspect to it, but give us a picture how challenging and hard it is between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States and the policies that they have.
Sorry, do you mind repeating the specific question?
Yeah, I want to know, apart from the things that we know between the United States and Iran, like nuclear, what other challenges they're playing, which makes it more complicated, that maybe we don't have an expertise view of yours to understand or look at it?
No, that's actually a very good question, because I do think that does get lost a lot of times, is Iran's sort of tentacles that are out through their proxies, right? At the start of this year, actually, seeing what Iran did in Houthis and working with the Houthis and sort of disturbing the processes in the Red Sea and sort of the secondary, tertiary impacts that it had in terms of even, being able for the supply chain and how do the shipments sort of run through the Red Sea and around the Red Sea and sort of, these sort of impacts that are at play. And that's just sort of, it feels a little bit more visible. But again, sort of the role that Iran plays in their engagement, whether it be with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with others in the region, I think that is a key factor. And so those are the elements that everyone takes a step back and tries to think about, if we do, action A, what are the repercussions? What are those secondary, tertiary actions that Iran or others can take in the region? And, what are they doing that can sort of disrupt various different flows? And in this case with the Houthis, in January, there was a sort of disruption to the economic flow, which has major impacts on your average citizen.
Just quickly, we talked about what's get on the news. One of the, I don't know, I'm sure you know, one of the aspects of the Houthis attacks in the Red Sea, it is disrupted. Even it's initiated by the United States helping the people in Sudan. And they're just trying very hard to find something, but they cannot access it, but because of the Red Sea is just very volatile and very unsafe and unsecure right now.
No, you're absolutely right. That is a key point in terms of the secondary and tertiary sort of impacts that you see. And I think when we think, that's just a perfect case in point in terms of when we think about foreign policy, national security, those are the types of decisions that administrations are thinking about. Folks that are sitting at the State Department or at the NSC, at the White House, this is what they're thinking about. What kind of impacts are you making when you're making certain decisions? What kind of impacts do the sort of geopolitical stance, who makes those decisions? What are they going to react to when you make a certain decision, and what are the repercussions you're going to have? Even when we think about sanctions too, what impact does it have? Who owns certain assets, right? Everyone is sort of cognizant of what those details look like, and it's discussed widely within the U.S. government.
So you're a true Iranian American, born and raised inside the United States. Let's talk about the Iranian American community. Let me start with this, or let me ask you this first. It looks like it, after what happened in Iran in 2022, killing of Mahsa Amini and the Women Life Freedom Movement, it looks like the Iranian diaspora, at least in the United States, never been this much in alliance and cooperation with the other like it was before. Is it a correct assessment to say? Do you see the same thing?
I think that's an excellent statement. Taking a step back, the Iranian American community, or the Iranian diaspora, or even the Iranians inside Iran, are not a homogeneous society in that sense, right? There are various different factions. The Iranian American community, there are many that are Democrats, there are many that are Republicans. But you're absolutely right. I think that was sort of the galvanizing event behind the movement. This grassroots movement was quite key. It brought everyone together, and I think that was sort of the foundational sort of shift that we saw, that we hadn't seen in years, was this ability for everyone to come together, the importance behind it. And I would say even the connectivity between the Iranians inside Iran and the Iranian American community, if we were to look at that, there was also, again, this connectivity across these lines that everyone could support, everyone could get behind, sort of the freedom of women and the importance of women's sort of ability to have a choice. And I think that was sort of the key factor, which was beautiful to see. And I think, and I don't know what your next question is, but I think just to highlight sort of the importance of that movement though, right? To take a step back and say, wow, this Generation Z, the youth movement that really was sort of the underpinning behind it in 2022 was remarkable. And I think this is one of the things that I even say when, even working with undergraduate students, they're of that same sort of population, and sort of this is a new generation. It's a completely new way of thinking. It's a completely new way of operating, and sort of being able to see kind of when they stand for something and when they think something is absolutely important, how they were able to come together, right, through technology, through sort of this cohesive nature, was truly remarkable to watch. And I think that was one thing that brought a lot of the Iranian Americans together, and the longevity of it, right? This was not an immediate movement that ended and fizzled out. You know, you can still see to this day sort of the discussions that continue to bring sort of, and has forced the hand of the international governments to take actions against Iran.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you agree on this, but I just want to share it with you. I mean, that's the sad part about the you know, unrest and movements inside Islamic Republic inside Iran. Every couple of years there's something, and sadly most of them is very tragic. From Negah Angha Sultan, if you think that shot on the streets till Aban 98 and what they happened over there. But as you said, you know, there were like demonstrations and protesters or so. That was different. This time, I think what happened with in the wake of killing of Mahsa Amini, many people who were just silent or never talked about it, they just had it enough. It says, this one I can't take. So whatever, for what maybe they had excuses for the previous year, this one they said, no, not even for me, I'm not taking it.
No, you're absolutely right. And I do think it's important to say that it truly sort of created that fissure. It truly shaped sort of the discussions, the ability to come together. I think that was the other thing, to be able to show that the communities can come together on certain topics. And you're absolutely right. Again, it was something that, again, depending on, you know, your background, again, going back to even Iranian Americans in the United States and even how they vote, very different, right? Most of the time the decisions that they either make are based on sort of US's foreign policy towards Iran, or it's their pocketbook, right? It's the idea of sort of what is the economics? What does this mean for my taxes? What does this mean for my day-to-day inside the United States? But it was the singular topic that everyone could come together and say, yes, we do need to change things. The unfortunate part was sort of the next step, what would happen next if the regime were to fall. And that was something that you saw that the Iranian American community or even the Iranian diaspora community could not necessarily come together.
I want to quickly ask you this, with your expertise on security matters. Islamic Republic has been through lots of, you know, demonstration over these years and just stayed. Do you think they can overcome this one?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think the timing of your question is quite interesting too, with everything that's happening right now in Iran. I think they unfortunately continue to clamp down on so many voices, civil society voices, and of course it's extremely important for Western governments to be able to support these civil society voices in the various ways that they're able to. I think it's hard to read the tea leaves on this one. I think it's very interesting to see, again, you know, what will happen to the next supreme leader. What does that mean in terms of the internal dynamics inside Iran? There's so much political jockeying that's happening right now in terms of not only the snap elections, but what's going to happen, what's the succession of the supreme leader. And I think there is that sort of interesting space to watch. We've now already seen that Iranians can come together on an issue. We can see sort of the force and the gravitas of Generation Z and kind of what they can do, which is very different than my generation that essentially was born around the Iranian Revolution, right? And so I think, you know, now we can see what that power is and sort of the changes happening, you know, politically within the regime. It's an interesting space to watch.
Last question, if I may. I'm sure you know about it. They try to put every community here in some kind of a category. Usually, for example, Hispanics are very usually affiliated with Democrats. They think also the Iranian American or Iranian diaspora is very Democrat or so. But strangely, we have very diverse community of the Iranians. We have not from Republicans. We have MAGA Republicans, MAGA Trump, to to Democrats, to even very, very progressive sides of it. How do you picture the Iranian American community and Iranian diaspora in the United States and how they're operating?
I think that's an excellent question. I think, yeah, that is a misnomer. Even with the Hispanic community, that is a misnomer. And it's across the spectrum. And I think that's what makes it such a healthy sort of debate, even amongst the Iranian American community, very similar to the Arab American community as well. I don't think there's necessarily differences. I think there's concerns in terms of voter turnout and sort of the ambitions and feelings by the diaspora community. But I do think it's important to go out and vote. I'll continue to stress that importance. But you're absolutely right. I think that is the beauty of it. You can't necessarily go to an Iranian American community and expect that you're going to get the same sort of perceptions, right? You can maybe socialize with them, but the decision-making factor is very different. And again, I think there's two bases. One is a very clear stream in terms of what is sort of the U.S. administration's policy against Iran. I think there are many people within the diaspora that believe sort of in the views and the perspectives of sort of either the center right or far right sort of perspectives of ending the regime in sort of a very sort of strong sort of engagement, sorry, I blinked on the word, and then sort of the democratic views and sort of where, how do we have those diplomatic conversations? So there is the sort of how do you have the engagement in terms of Iran policy, but again, there's also the domestic component. We are, at the end of the day, sort of Americans living in the U.S., and you have your day-to-day sort of thought processes. What does it mean in terms of economic relief? We all have various different views in terms of our backgrounds and what we're working on, some of our sort of social views. And so it's very hard to sort of pinpoint in terms of where this diaspora community will be based. And so the polling that's done by a lot of communities, I think, is quite important. It helps us understand a little bit more. But again, this is very similar to the Arab American population as well, in terms of where they're going to stand for U.S. politics. But again, at the end of the day, I think, we're here in the United States. It's important to be able to vote. It's, this is one of the things that I think, depending on what your immigration sort of journey was like or your family's journey was like migrating to the United States, a lot of times this is what you were essentially fighting for, is to be able to have these sort of rights to vote, and having sort of an economic sort of wherewithal and say in terms of who you're going to elect into office. So again, we're not a homogeneous society. I think that's the most important factor.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it coming here and talking to us.
Thank you again for having me.
این صدای آمریکاست.